Hello, I'm Cherry Potts, and I'm the spider in the title of this event. I'm the director of Arachne Press. So, why spiders? Well, when I started Arachne, I had a long list of potential names, which dwindled and dwindled as I found other people had already snaffled them, until I had about 5 left. One of them was Arachne. I liked it because we wanted a big web presence and because I've always used spinning and weaving as a metaphor for writing, to the extent that I went off and learnt how to spin and weave to make sure I was getting it right, so sort of method acting in reverse. And also because one of my first published stories was called Arachne's Daughters, and it was about stroppy women getting together to stand up for those too small to be heard. So I sent that list to everyone I could think of who had anything to do with books at all, booksellers, librarians, writers, publishers, saying, what do these names conjure up for you? Would you buy a book with this name on the cover? And the voting was pretty even, as you know, a few people for everything. But then someone came back saying, anything but Arachne, because people who hate spiders won't buy your books. And I thought, people who hate. And I stopped listening. Nothing like making me angry. And so that decided the name of the press, because I am really absolutely fine with people who hate not buying our books. Initially, we were quite London-centric. Our first book, London Lies, came out in 2012, and I was deliberately targeting the Olympic visitors to London. Don't know if we hit any of them, but that was the aim. And it did all right. And our second book, Stations, also London-based, charted stories of people living beside the new overground line from Highbury and Islington down to Croydon, with little offshoots to various places. It did really well, but I always wanted to reach outside London for audiences and for writers. And I've always said that I will publish anyone. So somewhere in amongst the anybody, I've found myself with a few niches almost by accident. We publish disabled writers, and we publish LGBTQ writers, and we publish writers from geographically isolated areas. We are soon to branch out further than we have already into the global majority and deaf writers, and I have other groups in mind. A while back, I was in a Facebook conversation with someone who's doing research in people who weren't getting published, and how the London centricity thing came up, and we were talking about pushing out beyond the M25, which we were trying very hard to do. And she said something about geographic isolation, and my ears pricked up because it was already an issue I was aware of. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Other people are thinking about this. And she said, And basically what we got down to was this was an acknowledged issue, but was being ignored. And is, of course, an issue. If you live on an island or right at one of the tips of the country, there are massive challenges in the concept of the book tour. And these are the same kind of issues for disabled writers. So, I figured out how to do that. We get funding, we pay for backup actors for if someone's not well enough on the night, all of that kind of thing. And we just accept that people will need somewhere to stay if they're travelling. Then it's not just going to be here and back, here and back, here and back, because that's exhausting and not very productive. And that all our venues have to be accessible, and anywhere that someone is staying has to be accessible. Costs money, get the funding. Fine. No problem. But then in lockdown, all of that became kind of irrelevant, didn't it? Because we were all doing everything on the internet, weren't we? And that's fine if you don't live somewhere where the internet only works intermittently, is absolutely not fibre. You can't always send emails from home, as one of my authors has to go to work if she wants to communicate with me. it does become a somewhat unattractive proposition, but I like a challenge. And when I'm talking about geographic isolation, I don't just mean people living right on the edges or in the middle of a moor or up a mountain or whatever, though that is the romantic version of it, isn't it? I mean people who live in places with lousy internet, no train station for miles, and only the occasional bus. And those places can be relatively urban. So how do we do it? Our Solstice Shorts Festival has been our route to find writers living in out-of-the-way places. Solstice Shorts is time-themed and held on the shortest day of the year, 21st of December, just before Christmas. It's quite a challenge. And I've got a bit obsessed with sunrise and sunset as a result, which led to our 2017 Dusk event, which was stories and poems and songs inspired by dusk. And it was a wave of words across the UK at the speed of dark. A series of 12 events that lasted the length of dusk, which is about 45 minutes. I think one of them was almost an hour. Starting as high up the UK as we could find someone to organise it, which turned out to be Aberdeenshire, and spreading across country as dusk hit each venue, taking in cities and rural communities and islands, until it finished in Redruth in Cornwall an hour and a half later, but with 9 hours of material. That was the first one we live streamed, which was partly me being a control freak and wanting to see all 9 hours, partly just because we wanted to create a dusk-starling murmuration of overlapping voices in the ether. Since then, we've done Time and Tide in 2019, which took place in coastal communities around the UK, which again has found us authors who live on the very edges of the country, in remote, hard-to-reach places. Some of them are very hard to reach. We had planned to have BSL interpreters at every event, but on the day, Saturday before Christmas, and finding that anybody who was actually available would have to travel maybe 400 miles in order to spend 45 minutes translating. And we thought, that's not a good use of anybody's time. So we actually translated the videos subsequently, which was an interesting project in itself. But it did, this is the sort of remote we're talking about. So our follow-up to all our anthologies, we do loads of anthologies, not just the Solstice Shorts one, is that having found people whose writing we adore, we say to them, got anything else? And when we're talking to the Arts Council, we call this our Evolve project. It's nothing of the kind, it's just me saying, have you got anything else? And Jackie Taylor, who's talking today, was somebody we found through Dusk, as it happens. And Clare Owen, who's also talking today, we found through another anthology, An Outbreak of Peace, in 2018. And so when I was looking at who had come forward as part of the Evolve project, I thought, I'm going to prioritise the LGBTQ, the disabled, and the geographically isolated this year. And so Jackie and Clare both live in Cornwall, and because they both live in Cornwall, we thought there might be some synergy, there might be some things that they could do together like this, despite the fact that their books are very different. Jackie's book, Strange Waters, is a novel for adults made up of short stories, and it's mainly set in the very near future, so the next 10 years or so. And then Clare's book is a young adult novel, Zed and the Cormorants, which everybody that we've sent it to for endorsement and whatever, the word that keeps coming back is gothic. But now here it is. It's been out since April and it's doing extremely well, and we're very, very pleased with it. So I've probably kiboshed what they were going to say in their introductions now, but I'm going to hand over to Jackie first and then Clare to tell you about their books. And then we've got a Q&A at the end, which will be live, So you can ask us all your pent-up questions at that point. Okay, thank you.
Hello, I'm Jackie Taylor, and I'm talking to you from Herodsfoot, which is a little village between the sea and the moors in southeast Cornwall. My collection of short stories, linked short stories called Strange Waters, is coming out with Arachne Press at the end of July. So this is a collection of stories that weave in and out of time, and really the theme that links them all is really longing for somewhere else, a better life. The grass is always greener, the idea that we always are longing for something that we perhaps don't have at the moment, or think we don't have at the moment. And although I didn't initially intend to write about Selkies and mythology, Selkies kind of snuck into the collection because the image of a Selkie woman standing on a cliff top, looking out to sea, with her family and land-based ties, but always yearning for the freedom of her life under the waves, seemed to fit with all of the stories that I was writing. The story that I'm going to read from today is called Lifelines, and actually it was inspired by the Torrey Canyon disaster. Torrey Canyon was a tanker which ran aground in 1967, spewing oil along the beaches of West Penwith, so the western half of Cornwall. And it was a huge environmental disaster at the time, which unfortunately I do remember, 1967. And at that time, people didn't know how to deal with this crisis, and the attempts to actually disperse the oil actually caused more problems, or caused as many problems as the original spillage. And the oil spills were napalmed and dispersed with detergents, and this did huge damage to the bird population. And what made me think about this was the stories that you can still smell that oil on some of the beaches in Cornwall, where it was dug in, ploughed into the sand, that after storms that you can still smell that oil, which is just really incredible and powerful and shocking, really, and really brings it home what happened then. And obviously the impact on bird life was enormous, and so the story that I'm going to read from deals with that, and deals with the story of the birds that were brought in to the hairdressers. This apparently happened to be cleaned up as they were rescued from the effects of the oil. They peered at the fuzzy square of their little village by the sea, like it was a foreign land they'd never seen before, and they watched until the little picture snowed over. Robert turned the aerial, and then Stan from the ship appeared on the screen, suddenly, alarmingly, dressed in a suit and tie, like he was off to a funeral, telling the camera about the holidaymakers and how they'd lose their summer trade unless something got done, and pronto. There was something about seeing it all unfold on the news that changed how they felt. They knew that outside the harbour and all along the coast, crude oil was arriving in thick, slow-moving blankets and sticking and covering everything in its path. The smell of oil and detergent everywhere was enough to make you gag. They all knew about the seabirds lying in black, thick oil. But there was something about seeing it all compressed onto a 16 by 12-inch screen and hearing it described by a BBC reporter in a posh, serious voice that made it so much more real. They were showing the earlier bombing of the oil slick on the news, and they could hear bombing now in real life. It's like the war, said Robert, and Stella rolled her eyes and yawned. Grace couldn't see how bombing the oil would help, but they were running out of ideas. They tried to scoop up the oil. Some of it got dumped in the old quarries. Then detergent, then napalm, then millions of free-floating, uncatchable drops. The salon doorbell rang. Robert said to Grace, "Better open up." It's still our lunch hour officially. She felt the need to establish the point, but went out anyway. Stella followed her. You sure you're all right? Stella caught hold of her wrist and whispered, I know someone who can help. Grace pulled away, took down the clothes sign and opened the door. Instead of one of their regulars, there was a woman in her 30s, dressed like she'd come off the boats, oilskins and yellow boots, red wind-burnt cheeks, dark curly hair scraped back into a ponytail. Grace stood at the door, protecting the clean lino. I won't come in, said the woman. We haven't got anything at the moment, Grace said. We're fully booked, but I can fetch the book. Next week we might be able to fit you in. She looked at the woman's hair, wiry, split ends, and made a mental note to block out a double slot. She bent down and lifted the corner to show Grace what she had. I thought, I know it's an imposition, but the woman straightened up and looked at her. I hate asking, but I have to do something. Robert said no, but Grace stood her ground, threatening to leave and take Stella with her. Appointments were cancelled. They got out all their towels, even the old ones they used for perms and colours that were stained with hair dye and patchy with bleach. Although she'd been brought up just a stone's throw from the sea, Grace had never learned the names of the seabirds, or how to differentiate one bird from another. If she had to refer to them at all, she called them gulls, generically, thinking that was good enough. Someone told her that most of the birds they were bringing in were either guillemots or razorbills, but there were others, just a mass of feathers and oil, blistered and singed, froth bubbling round their beaks, where they'd been preening and preening to try to clean themselves, and swallowing oil and detergent in the process. When it came to picking up the first bird, Grace had a moment when she didn't think she could. She retched emptily into the basin. The bird was wrapped up in a piece of black, oil-soaked cloth, its legs struggling feebly for some kind of purchase, its head hanging as if it were broken, but its eyes wild and alive. She wanted to run out of the salon, out of the village, to somewhere this wasn't happening. Stella, the farmer's daughter, was already stuck in. And we thought your coat stank, she said. Grace swallowed hard and forced herself to pick up the bird and take it to one of the back basins and unwrap it and start the process of trying to break down the oil with shampoo and hot water. People came to help, bringing towels, sheets, whatever they could find. They soon learned that a bucket system worked best, passing the birds from basin to basin. They put a crate on the floor for the birds that died in the process. The smell was like hell on earth, and the birds were covered in oil, and they were covered too, and the salon. And the girl and Robert started talking about compensation until the girls told him to shut up.
So my novel, Zed and the Cormorants, is set in a fictionalised version of the Foy estuary. And it's a story of 14-year-old Zed who moves from London to Cornwall because her dad thinks that a fresh start and a simpler life will be good for her mum's mental health and stop her sister Amy going off the rails. But no one really considers Zed and what she wants, and she's pretty devastated to leave behind all her friends in London and riddled with anxiety about starting a new school down here and fitting in. And also she's pretty unnerved about how isolated their new home is. And when things start to go wrong at home and in her local community, she becomes convinced she's under attack from a flock of cormorants. So the idea for the book came when I was walking in these woods, which are by the Foy estuary, and I had a vague idea about writing a story for young adults with a young person who was struggling with low self-esteem and feelings of isolation. And I was walking along and looking down at the sandbanks, and inspiration really struck when I saw two cormorants with their wings outstretched. And they were basking in the sun, and I thought how lovely and graceful and poised they look. but how would they seem to my young person who was already struggling with feelings of being overwhelmed and scared of lots of things. And I realised they could be seen as really quite sinister. So I went off and started researching them, and indeed they have been around since the dinosaurs, hence that very reptilian look. But what amazed me was how well they have survived and how well they've adapted in all different parts of the world. So I thought that's interesting. They could teach something to my young person about having to adapt to their new circumstances. And then I was kind of really amazed about how much they feature in literature. So they're in mythology from all around the world: Polynesian, Japanese, Chinese. In Ireland, if you see a cormorant on a church roof, it's a bad omen. In Norwegian myth, if you die at sea, apparently you can return as a cormorant to see your loved ones. And then when I looked into the Bible, they're mentioned 4 times, but always ranked with the unclean. They get a pretty bad press in Shakespeare too. He invents a word cormorus, which means voracious, greedy. Milton is not that flattering to them either. Satan disguises himself as a cormorant to spy on Adam and Eve, devising death to them that lived. So again, they were much maligned, and I began to think, well, my young person can probably understand that a little bit and relate to being misunderstood. And I wanted to write something that would address that balance. But if I was first of all able to really engage in that history and that world of mythology and really sinister magic, then it gave me an opportunity to explore anxiety and panic and things through a more gothic lens. So I could have 2 kind of stories running in parallel: a contemporary story of a young girl with a struggling family, but equally this otherworldly place and setting where she has a very tangible adversary to overcome ultimately. And by engaging with these birds and finding a way for her to make peace with him, it opened up a broader conversation and I suppose themes about the environment as well, and living in harmony with the natural world. The sky was changing colour. First threads of pale yellow light streaking across the blue above the treetops, and then the thin clouds turning into grey smudges against the pink and orange. As the fire died down, Zed was glad of her sweatshirt, and she pulled the frayed cuffs over her hands. She looked over to her paper birds, gently swaying in the breeze, and up to the leaves above, where a loose knot of twigs balanced in the fork of the branch. Was that a cormorant's nest? As if in answer to her question, she heard a long, drawn-out "ah!" Zed jerked around and grabbed Amy's hand. Where is it? Amy looked into the undergrowth. The light was fading though, and it was hard to see. But then a rustle in the grass, and the first cormorant stepped boldly onto the sand. The girl stayed completely still. It spread, then closed its wings, as if shaking out an umbrella. It straightened its neck, dipped its beak, and jolted its head to one side. That green stud of an eye, a surveillance camera, checking them out. You were right. It's just like a crochet hook, whispered Amy, hardly moving her mouth. What? Said Zed. That beak, it's... Shh! They felt a rush in the air behind them and swung around to see 3 cormorants, their webbed feet splayed out before them, coming into land on the sandbank and folding their glossy wings into their bodies as they tipped themselves upright. Another 4 were descending in a long, slow glide, breaking into the shallow water before stepping out and shaking themselves dry. Zed turned back to see 2 more coming from behind the clumps of reeds under the trees, and another 2 flying down from the left. Whether it was the embers of the fire or the girls themselves that the birds were unsure of, they kept their distance, taking positions around the edge of the little island. Amy glanced at Zed, waiting for her to do something. This was totally her call. One of the cormorants moved towards them. It stopped several feet away and dipped its head, as if it was also awaiting instructions. Very slowly, Zed got to her feet, dragging Amy up with her. Then, throwing back her head, she opened her mouth and let out a long, ragged screech. "What are you doing?" Amy whispered through clenched teeth. "Just copy me," said Zed. "Do everything I do." And she squawked again. Amy joined in, and the cormorants screeched back. One by one, they unfolded their wings, spreading their feathers, as if they were shaking out large black velvet gloves. They beat the air, and in the middle of the circle, the wafts of oxygen revived the fire. The girls, too, shook out their arms, the long sleeves of Zed's sweatshirt flapping up and down. The flames crackled, amber and tangerine, competing with the colours in the sky. A large cormorant stepped forward and slowed the beat of its wings to a gentle flutter, retracting them slightly and shuffling forwards, so that when the others followed suit, they closed up the circle in one long repeat pattern, like a concertina paper cutout, linked by the tips of their wings and silhouetted against the dying sun. Zed reached into her rucksack and pulled out a heavy, damp bag of raw fish. She gestured for Amy to unwrap their cooked mackerel and bring it into the centre of the circle, while she walked around the edge in front of the birds, laying their offerings in the sand. Zed kneeled down, and taking her portion onto her lap, she scraped off the black and scaly skin and then peeled a chunk of the pale grey flesh away from the bones. She placed it in her mouth and began to chew. Amy did the same. A few moments later, the first of the birds bowed down and delicately, as if using chopsticks, picked up the whole fish in its beak and flicked its head back so its mouth and throat were all in a straight line. A series of twists and shudders, and it swallowed the fish whole. The other birds joined in the feast.